Well, hello everyone. I hope each of you are enjoying spring break week. Maybe you won't listen to this until after spring break is over. I am enjoying my time in Florida. I know I said I'd probably give you a video lecture, but well, I spent the day in the sun, so I thought audio would probably work best for this. So, kind of for this coming week, I'll highlight some next steps at the end of this recording, and I will try not to lecture for 2 hours. Hopefully this will be pretty brief. I know you guys love it when I just talk straight for an hour or 2 hours. Just kidding. First, I just want to say congratulations on midterms. Well done. Well done. I am pleased to report that it was all passing grades for midterms, and you all did very well. So we will talk through those when I am back on, the 18th? Is that when I see each of you again? Yes, the 18th. And then I'll have next steps with discussion boards at the end of this as well. But we'll jump in today. We're going to be talking about gender and peer relationships, and so kind of starting in middle childhood and moving through adolescence. All right, as we jump in today, I do want to say that there's probably some areas I'm going to breeze through just so I don't spend forever lecturing, and as I do that, if some of these areas maybe didn't stick for you as well in the chapter, try to go back to the chapter and just read through that section again so that you just have a good grasp on the content. I tried to just put some of the highlights in these slides, but I know it tends to be a lot of information per chapter. And then I know you can't just raise your hand and ask a question, but you can definitely write down notes, and we will discuss any questions you guys do have when we get back to class on the 18th there. So to start off, this chapter just begins highlighting some of the differences in sex differentiation that begins at right around 5 weeks for fetuses. And so as this is taking place, essentially there's those 23 pairs of chromosomes, and if your 23rd pair, which determines sex, has an XX, you're typically going to develop female genitalia, and if there's an XY, you're typically going to develop male genitalia. Obviously, this chapter does touch on a lot of atypical development, so at this phase, we are talking about kind of typical development with the XX and XY, and there's a great overview on page 283 regarding how all the hormones, AMH and androgens and testosterones, are impacting the reproductive structures developing for people in this kind of 4 or 5 week area of life. So the way all fetuses look similar and have the same features until about that 5th week is it's just fascinating to me with development there. So I like that kind of overview on page 283 there, and then a little graphic there of genitalia and how it begins differentiating itself in that 5-week period. So as we do jump into this topic, I like that the book touches on, and I think it's true for all of us, that this topic of sex role development, gender role development, gender identity, even the terms sex versus gender, can elicit a lot of strong feelings, depending on our own experience with sex and gender, depending on the experience with maybe our children or our clients, even some of maybe what we've been taught in Christianity. So just recognizing those feelings in yourself as they come out reading this chapter, and then as you're listening to this lecture, and as we get to touch on this when we get back to class. So recognizing that these terms can have significant political, religious, and personal implications for us. So being as sensitive as you're able to be in our discussion boards this week, and then just kind of noticing what comes up for yourself. I think that's one of the best processes we can undergo as counselors, is just kind of continuing to be mindful when something maybe touches on an area for us that, that triggers a strong emotion or a strong response, and taking a moment just to dig into that and ask kind of what's happening. So as we move into this topic, I like that the book touches on kind of how we conceptualized the term sex as a biological construct, that it has to do with our biology, with our hormones, and that we've conceptualized gender as more of a social construct. So expectations in society, gender roles, things like that. However, as we've been learning over this whole semester, is both biology and environment impact our self-system. And sometimes the way we interact with our environment can actually alter our biology. And so that this is, that it's maybe not as clear as we want it to be regarding sex and gender, but putting those into the category of biological versus social tends to help individuals conceptualize them more. As we move into understanding early gender identity formation, there's kind of 3 stages the book touches on. The first is that we can begin to label gender. So we learn to label ourselves as male or female, typically right around 2.5 years old. We begin to understand stability in gender by around 3 to 4 years old. Realizing gender usually doesn't fluctuate over time, so a recognition in self at 3 or 4 years old that if I'm identifying as a girl, it's likely I'm going to keep identifying as a girl day after day after day. But then some real gender consistency kicks in around 6 or 7, where kids begin to realize that their gender likely cannot change. So if they identify as a girl at 6 or 7, they begin to realize I'm probably going to be a woman when I grow up. Or if they identify as a boy at 6 or 7, realizing I'm probably going to be a man when I grow up. I do think it's important to note here, though, in this 3rd stage, even as they're developing consistency, this does not mean that a child is comfortable with their gender. It often just means that they recognize it's likely not going to change for them. So most often, I appreciate that the book touches on that most often in that consistency stage, most children are embracing the gender identity assigned to them by parents, family, friends. They're embracing that wholeheartedly, so that's the majority. However, there are a significant number of children that struggle with the label placed on them. And this is where we as counselors have to create some sensitivity in how we respond to parents and children we might be working with. Thinking about how we create positive feelings towards this dichotomy of male and female given in our society, to help a child and a parent maybe create positive feelings towards both gender labels. Perhaps allowing children to see themselves on more of a spectrum if they're not feeling like one label fits, if they're feeling like it's too harsh or uncomfortable. Is there a reason we as a therapist feel the need to label their gender? And then when we're working with young kids and these labels do cause pain in their development of self-concept and identity, are there ways we can maybe help parents, help others in their life, even just stop labeling, stop assigning maybe gender labels of silly things like I was talking about in the book of, if I'm going to buy a little girl a truck, I'm going to buy her a pink truck. Like not doing those things that tend to cause pain for children that struggle to identify with the gender that's being assigned to them. And I really wish we had some class time to talk through this, because I think this can just be a really helpful conversation to have as we work with kids and parents. I know this has come up a lot in my counseling work, and I'm guessing it will come up in many of yours as well, especially when it comes to, working with new parents. I don't tend to do a lot with children, but I work a lot with parents, and then I work a lot with trauma survivors, and thinking about gender identity and gender development, when there maybe has been some pain along the way, either because of family or because of abuse or because of bullying, pieces like that. So I wish we had class time to kind of touch on this, but we will get into it in a discussion board here. All right, so since we don't have the ability to have this conversation in class, we want to take some time and do this in our discussion board this week and wrestle through some of these questions. And again, I just encourage sensitivity as we're responding to one another and as we're sharing and kind of how to best support children in this area and families. As always, I wanted to put in some helpful videos. These are actually from Dr. Jackson, videos that she found on gender identity, that just help us kind of think through these deeper pieces if this is an interesting area of development for any of you. So with gender identity, we want to look at three main areas. The way we socially process gender identity, the way our cognition impacts gender identity, and the way our biology impacts gender identity. So with social processing, or social processes in gender identity, there's the active teaching of gendered behavior by others. So the way we do or do not impress gender on young children is going to impact their perception of gender. And then the way there's often differing behaviors towards girl and boy babies, how we talk to them, how we play with them. We'll touch on what some of these differences are and what some of these differences are not later in the lecture. The role of cognition in gender identity. So the idea that logical thinking, whenever a child gets to logical thinking, that piece can really help them understand that gender consistency. So when they start building in a logic in that 6-7 year old range, that can help them really begin to have some stability, consistency in their gender. And then the accurate information is helpful. The book touches on kind of an interesting area there where it's like really giving children adequate language for their genitalia, whether they have penises or vaginas at that age, and beginning to teach them that is the biggest difference in how gender is assigned for that age. It's not what color you like playing with, it's not whether you like rough housing or wearing dresses, but that it is often biological sex or genitalia that someone is born with. And so helping children understand that, providing that accurate information, can help solidify that gender consistency for them. And then the idea that biology does really impact gender. So we talk about most often children identify with the sex or the genitalia at birth. However, in atypical gender identity development, individuals will reject the assigned identity and maybe adopt an identity consistent with their biology or more consistent with their self-perception. And so a lot of times this is touching on maybe some atypical biological development, or other areas of cognition or social processing where a child simply doesn't identify with the gender role, the gender identity that friends, family, or others have assigned to them. So I think it's helpful to touch on what some of the sex differences are. I would maybe encourage going back and just reading this in your chapter again. So the idea that there are just very practical behavioral personality and preferences that vary between males and females in early childhood and middle childhood. The largest factor being that boys and girls spend their time differently in these segregated groups. And there's a little debate as to whether or not this is due to gender roles or gender identity, or whether it's due to identifying individuals that are most like you, so that kind of in-group mindset, and then mimicking behavior of others. And then I think it's really important to note, I appreciate that the book does this, that the average difference between genders, so between that dichotomous male and female, is much smaller than the range of differences within each gender. And so with that, yes, there are some quantifiable differences, but the differences are much smaller than the within group differences in each gender already. And so that individuals in early development, middle childhood, adolescence, even early childhood, that the range of behaviors for what is maybe typical or common or appropriate is quite vast for each gender. And not to pathologize children that maybe act in a way that's outside of maybe our own adult construct of gender, and we'll talk about this later with parenting in the chapter, but to allow children to experience gender kind of as it develops for them, rather than putting harsh stereotypes or gender roles on children, when there really is a lot of within group difference for what behavior would be just completely common or appropriate. So why does biology generate some of these differences? So as we look at, again, that early development, even in utero, there's some masculizing hormones, androgens, that begin really creating some of the differences between male and female genitalia, and then those androgens continue into childhood, and androgen levels have been linked to some aggressiveness, and so we might see that more in young boys. And then that at puberty there's some hormonal changes and hormonal differences that really start to emerge. And so I like the example from the book here that depressive symptoms increase for both boys and girls after puberty. However, they increase more for girls. And then boys show more increases in aggressive, more delinquent behaviors than girls. And oftentimes that can be tied directly to the androgens, the testosterone, the estrogen, the way hormones are really changing and displaying differently in later childhood, middle childhood, and early adolescence for teenagers. So with that, that those hormones are changing naturally on their own within our bodies, within our biology, but then also that the book touches on that sometimes there's experiences that we're having that can change hormone levels as well. So experiences that we're having in our environment, trauma can impact hormone levels, what we eat can impact hormone levels. So there's a lot of ways that it's not just biological, but also environmental. And then that there's just some practical brain structure differences. And so there's greater evidence of lateralization in males than females. And that's where there's greater differentiation in the functioning of the two hemispheres of the brain, with language functions more clearly governed by that left hemisphere in males than in females. And so, again, some of the experiences that we're having can impact a brain structure as well. So, again, it's that both and biology and the environment. So we looked at the role of biology in generating sex differences, and now we want to look at the role of cognition in generating sex differences. So those advances in reasoning that we were talking about earlier, that gender identity kind of functions as a part of logical thinking. So as we begin having more logical thinking and more concrete thinking, our gender identity really solidifies. And then with self-socialization, that we observe others, that when we observe others interacting, we really develop an internal motivation to learn what it means to be male or female, and then to mimic those behaviors. And then the book touches on this idea of gender schemas, which I think is really helpful. So a gender schema is our network of expectations and beliefs about male and female characteristics. So with that, that's going to be what we've observed in others, what we've been told about being male or female, likely if we have male and female parents, how we've observed them interacting with each other, with other children, how they've interacted with us. It's going to create a set of expectations and beliefs about being male or being female. And then schemas affect what we pay attention to, what we interpret, and what we remember about events. So we're constantly evaluating our own behavior and then the behavior of others based on these schemas. And this is often where some stereotypes can develop and really begin influencing children and children's ideas of male versus female, regardless of how true they are. And then there's the role of parenting in generating sex differences. So because we are a human growth and development class, the chapter touches on Freud's psychoanalytic theory. So the idea that individuals are identifying with their same-sex parent in order to resolve their Oedipus or electrical complex. And this identification involves imitation to resolve their stage of sexual desire. And I think there's a helpful note in the chapter there that discusses that although many aspects of Freud's understanding of sexual desire, competition, and fear in young children have become deeply embedded in our culture, that a lot of efforts to validate this theory have been unsuccessful. So that Freud provides maybe an interesting perspective for us, but when we've really dug into the research and tried to determine if young girls really, develop sexual desire for their dad because they have penis envy, and then begin relating more to their moms. As we consider those things and really look at that in the research, we just find that that Freud gave an interesting tale that does not actually match real life experiences. So we take that and we consider it. And then there's social learning theories, and so these can be helpful when considering the different parental behavior with boys or girls. When we think about interacting with boy babies, oftentimes individuals are more likely to handle boy babies in active ways and bouncing, whereas with girl babies, more likely to be kind of like gentle and speak soft to them, or even describe little boys as big and strong, but use terms like sweet or pretty or kind or you're such a sweet pea. you're such a little angel with girls. And then as children get older, mothers talk more and use more supportive speech and talk about emotions more with their daughters. So that there is just there are some practical differences in typical parental behavior, and so that's something just to keep an eye on in our own lives as well in the lives of clients that we work with. And then that there's some direct teaching of gendered behavior as well, that sometimes we have expectations for children based on their gender, and that can differ. And then there are times when there's maybe rewards or punishments for gendered behavior. And I think we see this a lot in those expectations of maybe what sport someone is going to play, or if they're going to be good at it, how we'd respond to our daughter pushing the bully down on the playground versus our son pushing the bully down on the playground. What type of actions or behaviors are acceptable, and then the research showing us that fathers are more likely to be disapproving of cross-sex behavior in sons than in daughters. So that daughters can exhibit behaviors that maybe are more likened to males or boys without too much difficulty from fathers. But if the little boys are imitating behaviors that a father would typically link with a female, that studies have shown that there's more disapproval in those areas, which can impact a child's gender identity, whether it's a little boy experiencing that or whether it's a little girl watching that experience. And then real quick, just to touch on peer interactions, that we've already emphasized how some of that sex segregation is beginning as early as 2.5, and by middle childhood becoming a little bit more extreme. Typically we start seeing girls spend much of their unstructured time with girls and boys with boys. And as we do this, or as children do this, as we see this, we'll often see some of those group differences magnified when it comes to behavior within the group. So how girls are behaving towards one another and how boys are behaving towards one another. We tend to see those differences magnified when children are segregated. And then by adolescence, we're beginning to build more cross-gender relationships, but we often have such differing styles of interacting by that point in life that there can be some difficulty as guys and girls are beginning to want to interact with each other more in adolescence. All right, and then most of this kind of coming together around an idea of a multidimensional theory of sex differences. So the sex role development is actually multi-dimensional. That there's several theories out there of sex role development, whether it be cognitive or social, and that there's some empirical validation for each of those, but then there's also weaknesses within each of those. So that sex development is taking place through all of these dimensions. And so the chapter touches on kind of 3 categories of variables that are interacting reciprocally with one another. And so personal influences. So our own personal concepts of gender, our affective and biological features, behavioral influences, so our learning and execution of activities that are linked to gender, and then environmental influences, so family, peer, society, and these influences are interacting and molding both our motivational and our self-regulatory structures that determine our behavior and that determine our our gender identity, because within that is the gender-linked behavior. And so taking more of a multidimensional approach, that it's not just cognitive, it's not just affective, it's not just social, but it's kind of all of these areas interacting with one another to create the concept of gender identity in middle childhood and adolescence. And then there's the importance of peer relationships. So we're going to have some concept of our gender or our sex differences, and then a big piece of development in middle childhood and early adolescence is our relationship with peers. And so our peer group is emerging. Groups are beginning to kind of define themselves within their interactions. And these peer group interactions are different than just the social interactions we're having as individuals or individual friendships. The peer groups actually hold a lot of control over what individuals determine as normal or acceptable social behavior in middle childhood and adolescence. And so children are trying to develop social competence. This is going to be a criteria for peer group acceptance, whereas the social competence is going to need to have some effective responses of empathy and valuing others, some cognitive processes of taking others' perspectives, making mature moral decisions tend to lead to greater acceptance and social competence. And then developing social skills, so those discrete, observable behaviors, making eye contact with others, using appropriate language, asking appropriate questions at the appropriate time, that these social skills build into someone's competence or social competence, and their ability to fit into and to connect with their peer group. So why is this peer group so important? Well, because children are actually really good at determining who fits and who doesn't. So there's a study in the chapter it was touching on how children were able to perceive if someone was going to have either mental illness or difficulties with emotional regulation later in childhood by how they were acting earlier in childhood. So this is the idea of sociometry, where we're measuring an individual's status within a peer group, how they fit. So assessing social competence, and it uses children's nomination of their peers to evaluate peer status. So in what category they fit in the peer group. And so we're combining positive forces like attraction with negative forces, repulsion, and indifference, so the absence of attraction or repulsion in helping to determine peer status. And so there's a social preference score, where it's the count of positive versus negative peer nominations or mentions, and then the social impact score, so the total of both positive and negative nominations. And this is going to create some sociometric statuses that we're going to assign, or that we could assign to children, that children often assign to each other unknowingly, that this isn't necessarily conscious behavior, but that through study and analysis we can help children determine where their peers fit. And this has some really interesting implications for how children are perceived by others and how they interact with others. So let's take a look at what the 5 most common sociometric statuses are. So we have popular, average, rejected, controversial, and neglected. So when we're looking at sociometry, there are these 5 categories children can fit in based on their preference and their impact from the 2 scales. And so Popular children tend to receive a lot of positive nominations and few negative nominations. They're well-liked members of the group and have both high visibility among their peers. Average children are those who receive an average number of positive and negative nominations, near the mean on both preference and impact scales. Neglected children are those who receive just few nominations overall, positive or negative. They have a low level of social impact. Rejected children receive a lot of negative nominations and few positive nominations. They're typically disliked, low preference, but have more of a high visibility or high impact than a neglected child would. And then the final category, controversial, is a relatively small group of children, but these are the children that receive many positive nominations and many negative nominations. So they have high impact but average preference, and they're controversial because they share many of the same characteristics with the popular group and with the rejected group. So take some time reading through these sociometric statuses in your chapter. There's lengthy explanations of each and what these categories are, and if they were to, end up on a final exam, that you have a good idea of what the characteristics are of each group and why a child would fall into it based on kind of the positive and negative nominations within the group, and then preference versus impact. So are they getting positive recognition from the peers, and are they getting any recognition from their peers? And so this just helps us see how kids see each other, and kind of how they place each other when they're interacting within classrooms, within peer groups, how they perceive one another. And this can really impact, if a child is feeling neglected by their peers, they're not getting many negative or positive nominations, they're just not really seen. This can impact a child's social development. Or if a child falls in the popular category, where they're getting a lot of positive nominations and few negative nominations, but they are highly seen, they're highly visible, that's going to impact their self-concept. And so thinking about this for our own children, for the children that we counsel, and then for how children are interacting with one another. All right, just a couple kind of final notes on sociometry. So there are some gender and cultural differences within the way peers are labeling one another. And so there's less tolerance of gender inconsistent behavior by males. So the idea of girls being, socially withdrawn, they are going to be less rejected than maybe males that are socially withdrawn, because other boys are expecting males to be assertive or to be aggressive. And then aggression has been associated with peer rejection, and helpfulness associated with popularity across both Western and non-Western cultures. And so I thought this was an interesting point in the book, since much of the research on peer relationships has actually come from Western culture, the US and Canada, that this provides really a incomplete picture of peer relationships, but one area that has been studied in non-Western cultures, looking at aggression, that is often associated with rejection, regardless of what culture you're in. And then that there's some differences in the way adults intervene across cultures. And that when somebody finds themselves falling into a category, if they fall into the popular or the rejected category, these are the most extreme categories, but also the most stable. These don't tend to change much over time. So if you're getting a lot of positive nominations or a lot of negative nominations, that can be really difficult to move out of that category. And then neglected and controversial statuses can have some change over time. Those are the easiest categories to move in and out of. I haven't gone back and looked at how long this has been yet, but I feel like I've been chatting a while, so I'm going to try to wrap this up for you guys pretty quickly here. So wanting to take a look at the measurement of peer groups, so this idea of cliques and crowds and networks of individuals setting norms for dress and behavior. That this is just so important to middle childhood and early adolescence, the idea of friendship within groups, but then where somebody falls in kind of the social hierarchy or social category. This can have just a lot of significance within school systems, depending on what systems a child typically interacts with. Where they fall within that social system is just going to have a lot of impact on their self-concept. And so when they find themselves fitting, they find themselves identifying or establishing an identity, they establish some acceptance and some belonging, and then that sometimes they don't establish acceptance and belonging. They're rejected from a peer group, or they find themselves in a peer group that has a lot of negativity. But these peer groups are really, really crucial. So let's jump into kind of some of their influences on behavior. So here we see that peer groups are the places where thinking and behaving are being reinforced for individuals in middle childhood, early adolescence, and even into late adolescence, and that there's beneficial as well as harmful impacts. So there's important protective factors of being in a group, fitting in, feeling like others have your back, you have a place. However, there's peer pressure, and this can often be really indirect rather than coercive, but just an expectation of behavior in the group that a child will feel the need to meet. And then peer groups can really limit someone's range of opportunities. So if a peer group has, kind of a perception within the group that, we're all jocks or we're all sporty, it may be more challenging for somebody within that group to join the chess club or to join some type of physics group after school. So peer groups can really limit those opportunities. And then these groups are forming through both influence and selection. So peer groups are influencing and causing individuals to conform to the norm of the group, but then individuals are also choosing whether or not they want to affiliate with others that share similar behaviors and attributes. So it's kind of a both and with how groups form, and then whether or not a child, teen, adolescent would choose to identify with that type of group. So why spend time chatting so much about peer groups? Well, because as children mature, friendships, peer groups, and other extra familial settings are increasingly important. And those early childhood, in that early childhood time frame, and even into middle childhood, the family and the school were the most primary settings in a child's life. But now, as they're moving into middle childhood, they find themselves caring much more about friendships and peer groups. And we talked about those protective as well as risk factors, and those are going to be pervasive in this stage. And so when we're working with clients in this area, we want to be assessing for their peer groups, what their friends are like, who they're interacting with, how positive versus negative they feel about these interactions. Even asking some of those self-nomination questions. So I'll ask clients sometimes, if you had to pick a friend to study with, who would you pick? A client that I'm working with some grief, it's like, if you were going to open up about losing your dad to one of your friends, who would you pick? So asking questions and kind of seeing who they self-nominate, that tells you a lot about their peer group and maybe who we can build as additional protective factors in their lives, or who we can encourage them to spend time with. being very careful when we're working with a child or adolescent that's experiencing some peer rejection, not to dismiss how huge and how impactful that is, not to blame our client for those negative interactions, maybe their withdrawal, maybe their aggression, things like that, but to try to work on those behaviors with them. And then to think about what skills need to be built for children. That rejected children do often have deficits in social skills, but that working on just individual training with a kiddo can be pretty ineffective, that we do have to include the peer group in that training, that we can't leave out the peer group when we're working with a kiddo, and just help them develop a good positive identity and positive self-concept. Well, it's a really hard thing to do if they're not getting any peer approval. So when we're working with a child or a teen facing this peer rejection, often it's going to be utilizing homework, assignments, maybe even the therapeutic relationship to have some positive interactions with peers. That's going to be crucial for building that self-concept. And then for significant applications, when we're talking about kind of gender and sex, the challenges faced by boys and girls in middle childhood and adolescence do really tend to differ. The risk of internalizing disorder is greater for girls. There's some clinical syndromes that are more frequent among boys, that children are really influenced by those gender role expectations, and that can impact how they perceive themselves, how they perceive others. That can also limit their opportunities right along with peer groups. And then in this phase, we really encourage counselors to kind of examine their own schema. So what schema you've built around gender and gender identity. And then kind of thinking specifically when working with young boys, we tend to do a really good job with girls, but with boys, boys are more likely to hide feelings of sadness and fear, starting as early as 3 to 4. That they kind of go by boy code, which allows anger more so than the full range of emotions. So to help teach parents and teachers and others to really support the full range of emotions for boys, just as we do for girls in this phase of middle childhood and early adolescence, and even early childhood, as we're seeing that, this is happening as early as 3 to 4 years old. So we want to just be very conscious of that as therapists. And, if we find out that an 8-year-old boy is coming into our office versus an 8-year-old girl, do we already have stereotypes about who that person is and what's going on in their life, what maybe they're struggling with? Like, do we have strong schemas about gender identity that are maybe impacting the way that we work with our clients, the way that we talk to our client, maybe even how we would diagnose our client? I know for me in working with trauma that I've spent enough time, kind of studying trauma, that at least when it comes to the dichotomy of male versus female, I know that there's different statistics with physical abuse and sexual abuse and neglect. But I also know that that dichotomy of gender has, kind of left a gaping hole for some of the individuals that come to see me that maybe don't clearly identify as binary in terms of male versus female. So I think we as counselors just have the challenge of addressing our own schemas and our own perceptions and our own ideas when clients are coming in to see us. So I wish we could have a deeper conversation here in class. I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on this, but we'll touch base when I see you guys on the 18th. And before I forget, I want to jump to the next slide here that just talks about kind of what's next. All right, so next week on the 18th, when I see you, we'll go through the midterm review. I'll give out the midterms, talk about grading. Make sure you come to class having read chapter 9 on the 18th, and write down 4 things that you found interesting, confusing, doubtful, or incredible. We'll start by chatting through those once we get to chapter 9. I'm going to post the sign up for our group presentations. So you have 4 options for dates. Pick one of those with your group and then start planning to turn in your group paper and presentation. So that'll be due March 25th. I'll look forward to seeing each of you on the 18th, and feel free to email or reach out with any questions you have in the meantime. All right, bye guys.